Monopoly, bringing families together and sometimes tearing them apart for nearly a century. The most popular board game in history, the iconic London Monopoly, was made by Waddingtons of Leeds. This is the story of how a Leeds institution, known for printing playing cards and theatre flyers, went from rags to riches, then seemingly disappeared from the face of the city. It almost never happened. Tumultuous early years at the firm gave no clues as to the success story to come.
My name is John Watson. I, for about 7 or 8 years in the 1970s and 80s, worked for John Waddingtons in Leeds. Most notably for the 3 years prior to 1979, I was the managing director of Waddingtons Games. That's the games subsidiary of Waddingtons. It's what everybody knows Waddingtons for, but in fact it was only about 20% of the turnover. We never owned the business. It was never a family company in the normal sense. It was started by a chap called John Waddington, personally, who was no relation to us. And he got it started. He built it up to about 50 employees. But under his management, it went bust. My grandfather, Victor Watson, had been apprenticed there as a printer, and he was the lithography foreman when it went bust. And he was faced with losing his job. But he said to the board, look, I think I can save this company, because he'd spotted all sorts of things that were going wrong. He got the confidence of the board to do that. And that was more or less at the time of the First World War. And the company did not then go bust. So he saved it. And having saved it, he took it into playing cards and then games and cartons and all sorts of plastics, all sorts of things. He then died in 1943. And my father took over as managing director. And people say, well, how come if they didn't own it, how come your father took over? They just did in those days. It was nepotism at its finest. And the company didn't suffer. So my father was then managing director throughout the 40s and 50s. He left to be chairman in the 60s. And then his eldest son, my brother, confusingly also called Victor Hugo Watson, he then became managing director, and he retired, I think, in the early 1990s, but then as chairman. So there was no family ownership as such, but there was serious family management, because at its peak, Waddingtons had about 3,500 employees, about half of whom were in Leeds. So it was a socking great company. And everybody thought we owned it, because the family dominance was so great. He was from the London theatrical world, and he realised that the London theatre programmes were terribly expensive and rather bad quality. And he found that Leeds was the centre of the printing industry. And therefore he said, well, the best machinery, the best materials, and the best skilled printers are going to be in Leeds. So he set up John Waddington Limited in Leeds in about 1880. And it was a big success. The main thing he had to do was to sell theatre programmes to the London theatres. And he really did. So it was a big success, made a lot of money. But being theatrical, he had to spend even more. So he was staying in the finest hotels in London, entertaining like there was no tomorrow, and kept running out of money. So he kept having to bring in injections of more theatrical capital. At one time, it was owned by a chap called Fred Carno, who was the Fred Carno outfit, which was a play on words for chaos, really, in the First World War. He went through various. He was always the owner, but he had huge debts all over the place. And by about 1913, the debtors called him out and said, "Look, we want some money back." And the bank, who was the board that was comprised entirely of banking people and senior people around Leeds, said, well, it's gone too far. So they asked my grandfather, Victor Watson, to take over. John Waddington stayed with the company for a while, but then he was fired for embezzlement of his own, what had been his own company, mainly because he'd been selling apprenticeships. You know, if you wanted going back to 1919, 1920, a skilled lithographic printer was the equivalent of today's airline pilot or something, you know, very, very top of the range skilled job, or even a surgeon. So you really wanted to get your son trained as a printer. So you approached John Waddington, you gave him, I think the going rate was 4,000 quid, huge amount of money. You gave him that and you got your son apprenticed. The trouble was he didn't regard that as the company's money. He regarded that as his money. And they sacked him. And I've got the minutes of the board meeting at which John Waddington Esquire was fired from John Waddington Limited.
So my name is Robert Shale. I'm Professor of Film History, and I also head up research in the School of Arts at LeedsBID. I'm interested in children's culture, and that's an area of research for me. And that's what led me via board games to Waddingtons here in Leeds. If you go right back to the beginning, it's not the company that you think of. You think of Waddingtons, who made Monopoly. But of course, if you go back to the beginnings in the late 19th century, they don't make board games at all. John Waddington is a printer. He prints posters for theatre companies in Leeds and in London. And that's his business. By the early 20th century, he loses interest in that, really. And it's actually one of his printers, John Watson, who comes forward and takes over the business and restarts it. And it has gone through various ups and downs, not particularly successful until they discover that they can make playing cards in the period after World War I, when playing cards are very, very popular. And suddenly there's the beginning of a business.
If Monopoly transformed Waddingtons, it was playing cards that laid the foundations. And during the horror of the first half of the 20th century, a certain wartime leader called on Waddingtons to do their bit for the war effort.
We couldn't make playing cards in the first few years of the war because it was impossible to get playing card board. The supply of pulp and paper and cardboard was very, very difficult in the first few years of the war, to such an extent that playing cards just weren't made. They were then made again in 1942 at the insistence of Winston Churchill. If I can, I'll just read this letter to you. You can hear Churchill coming through on it, which is from the Prime Minister to the Board of Trade, 26th July 1943. This is Churchill. I am told that in spite of contributions from civilian suppliers, there is at present a shortage of playing cards for use by the forces and workers in industry. The importance of providing amusement for the forces in their leisure hours and in long periods of waiting and monotony in and out of the way places, and for the sailors penned up in their ships for months together, cannot be overstated. Nothing is more handy, more portable, or more capable of prolonged usage than a pack of cards. Let me have your report on this subject, and show me how you can remedy this deficiency. It ought to mean only a microscopic drain upon our resources to make a few 100,000 packs. As a result of that, I think more or less the following day, Waddington's got a supply of playing card board, and we're able to present to them. And then it says later on, a separate note, the important thing is to have cards freely forthcoming when called for, and although the soldiers should have priority, civilian workers need them too. So the idea that Churchill, with a war going on, all the decisions he had to take, should take his time to send something like that to the Board of Trade is astonishing. Yeah.
But they always had sidelines, if you look at the company as well. That's something that's not well known about them. But a lot of their money initially came from making cardboard cartons. But it brought the money in. So manufacturing orange juice cartons or the boxes for Easter eggs doesn't grab the eye quite so much, does it? but that's how they brought the money in. Right to the end, they were still making cardboard packaging. They discover this. Again, these things are accidental sometimes, aren't they? It's Parker Brothers in the United States who want to license Monopoly and have a British partner to sell it in the UK. And it's Waddingtons they happen to go to because they're printers, principally. They can make the boxes as well for the board game to go in. So who's to know that that's going to take off? But it does. And suddenly, Waddingtons are a very, very different company from the point they start manufacturing Monopoly. Off they go.
Thanks to Waddingtons, Monopoly takes off in Britain. But this game of ruthlessness and exploitation could have been very different.
So I suppose the irony, I guess, is that the origins of Monopoly lie in a game that was known as the landlord's game, which was created in America in the 30s by a Quaker woman. And what she wanted to do was illustrate how evil capitalism is, and in particularly the whole idea of ownership, of owning property, and charging people for rent and so forth. So the game was designed to illustrate that. It was known as the landlord's game. It's a rather long, convoluted story, but eventually it came into ownership of the Parker brothers. They weren't interested in the message. They were interested in the game. They thought it was a good game that played well. And so they massively redesigned it, it has to be said. It's a very different game when they produce it. And of course, it was a huge success. She quickly discovered that this had happened. And she did go to Parker Brothers and point out that somewhere in that line of ownership was her game. And that possibly they owed her a lot of money for the success they'd had with it. What they did was they agreed to manufacture her game. The two games sat alongside for a period. You could buy either. And of course, they pointed to the fact that the public didn't want the landlord's game, that it didn't sell. And therefore, they had proved their point in a way, that their version was the one people wanted. And people didn't want, as it were, the socialist game with its message.
The explosion in Monopoly's popularity completely reshaped Waddingtons. From a business of 20 employees, now there were thousands. Waddingtons published hundreds of board games and card games while maintaining its status as a pioneer of packaging.
It went viral on a 7-year cycle, and nobody has ever known why the cycle was 7 years. It was published in Britain for the first time in 1935, and it was an immediate hit without much advertising or anything. So 1936-37 were boom years. And I think Waddingtons made about 300,000 sets of Monopolies in that time. Now, that had a huge impact on the company's turnover. I think that Monopoly as a single product probably got to about 40% of the company's sales. I'm guessing in saying that, but it seems to have been about that. And then it declined a bit, and everybody thought it was going to be a one-hit wonder. And then right at the end of the Second World War in 1945, there was a sudden great boom again. And I know it then sold 500,000. And then again in 1952. And people, when I was the MD there in the 1970s, people were trying to find reasons for this 7-year cycle. But we never did, or we knew whether it happened. And we could plan for it. You know, you get to 5th and 6th year and doing the company budgets, you say, well, every 7th year we get a peak in sales. And at its biggest peak, which was in the 1970s, we sold 700,000 sets in 1 year, which is staggering, actually. Well, this is a modern product, but the board is unchanged from the 1930s. This is all the London streets that everybody will know, and go back to Old Kent Road and go directly to jail and so on. So that's the board. And all the places on here were chosen by my grandfather. He made a visit to London because he got the American version. It was based on the streets of Atlantic City. And he realised that to sell it in England, it would have to be London streets. So he and his secretary went down to London for a day trip on the train and laid everything out. And they went round London, picking nice areas and bad areas. And the truth is they got it wrong, because the cheapest properties are Old Kent Road and Whitechapel Road. Well, they did go there. But if you wanted the worst properties in London at the time, you should have gone to Mile End Road or somewhere around Dockland. They never got that far. They got as far as Old Kent Road. there was a perfectly reasonable middle-class area at the time. Of course, this proved to be prophetic, because 20 years later, nobody wanted to buy a house in Old Kent Road. And similarly with Mayfair and Park Lane, they thought those were the poshest area. Well, they weren't. I mean, there's no Chelsea on here, no Belgravia or anything. And Mayfair was all company offices, so not many people lived there. So those, and then it was the English version that was sold throughout the Middle East in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So all the big Arab oil millionaires thought if they wanted to buy a house in London, they were going to buy one in Mayfair. And they did. And there was a huge escalation of prices in Mayfair that people couldn't really understand. Well, it was because that's where everybody thought was the best place in London. It wasn't. Never had been. And then you've got all the other places in between. Absolutely fascinating. And he was supposed to get all the streets, didn't get enough. So when they thought they'd got them all, but were one short, they stopped for a coffee at the Angel Islington. Well, it's not a street, it's a pub. Yeah. But they'd gone in there to the Lion's Corner House, bang next door to the Angel Islington, and said, oh, well, let's put the pub on the map. That's what he's doing there. Where is it? Yes, the Angel Islington. 100 quid.
Whole books and theses have been written on how to play the game of Monopoly. The answer? Plenty of strategy and very little mercy.
In terms of investment, these are the ones to buy, because the properties along there are very cheap, and then the houses are 50 quid each. So that's a reasonable strategy in its right. Here, you can afford to buy the whole lot because they're not expensive. The houses are £100 each. So you can get 4 houses there, you can get to a hotel without going through all your cash. The big advantage is that when you throw dice from there to get out of jail, you're likely to land on those squares more than any other. And you're likely to go to jail at some time. You can go to jail here, there are go to jail cards and things like that. So the odds of people landing there are very high, whereas the odds of somebody landing on the greens, which are terribly expensive, are really quite low. There have been 2 books on it. One was published in the 1970s, which was full of equations and graphs and things like that. We used to give it away as gifts from Waddington. I'm sure I didn't know anybody who read it, but I met the woman who wrote it, who was a maths graduate from Princeton University in America. And she'd done all the sums and came up with 5 or 6 different strategies. That was the best by far. Buying Mayfair and Park Lane, which a lot of people try to do, was almost the worst strategy to go for. It was fascinating, actually. And then somebody else wrote about the mathematics of the money supply and how long it should take. And a good game of Monopoly, I've heard people say it should be over in an hour. It isn't. If you get 4 competitive players and they know how to bid and deal and negotiate with each other, it's going to take an hour and a half. And you've got to deal with each other. A lot of people, when they're playing it, you'll say, well, look, you've got those 2 and I've got these 2, should we do a swap? And that's the crucial stage in the game. That's when winners are made or not. And a lot of people will say, well, maybe in a move or 2, but not just yet. Right, they're killed, they're going to lose, because they've missed the moment to deal and trade. Fascinating.
Monopoly has always been controversial. It's a game that's based on winning by destroying others. And some board games are not like that. You simply win. It's a race, as it were. Whoever gets there first wins. Somebody is second or third. But in Monopoly, there is no second or third. You win by eliminating others. That aspect, with its ruthlessness, and people will use that word when they talk about Monopoly, has always been a controversial element. And I think anybody who's played Monopoly will know that you discover things about people you know in your family or friends, particularly about the person who wins. I can tell you honestly, I never win. I don't have what it takes to win Monopoly, but I have a brother-in-law who does, and my son also does. Watch them transform when they play Monopoly into the Monopoly version of themselves, and a certain dimension of their personality emerges. And I'm sure anybody who's played the game will know exactly what I'm talking about.
Hello, I'm Kitty Ross. I'm the curator of Leeds history for Leeds Museums and Galleries. I think it's always saying that sort of certain things like board games or books are sort of disappearing and being taken over by digital, but actually I think there's a lot of nostalgia, but also sort of younger people actually suddenly come back to sort of realising that something physical, actually playing a game for real is more interesting and more engaging than doing everything virtually. It's certainly, I think there's been a renaissance in people playing board games socially as well.
As Waddingtons grows in the late 30s and into the 40s, its contribution to the war effort grows too. And it wasn't just playing cards being sent to the troops. Monopoly was a way to sneak vital tools and information past German guards.
There's some truth in it, but it's regrettably short of 100%. I mean, what is true is that games of Monopoly were included in the Red Cross parcels sent to prisoners of war. It's certainly true that within those Monopoly sets, laminated between the printed surface of the board and the cardboard, there were silk maps of the same kind that Waddingtons had already made to sew on the inside of airmen's jackets, so that if they were shot down, they could figure out where they were. They were made of silk, so they didn't rustle inside your leather jacket, and therefore the journalists didn't know where they were there. So the same silk maps were laminated inside Monopoly boards. That happened. Certainly there was some currency interleaved with Monopoly notes that could have been of use. Obviously, it was, a British forgery of German notes, but I think it was usable. In order to know that the game had been doctored, there was a tiny full stop printed after the word free parking on the boards that had been doctored. So if there was no full stop, there were just standard games. If there were, there was the lamination there. The story is also told that some of the tokens were made of pure gold for the purposes of negotiating when they'd escaped. I have never seen any evidence of that, but it's a nice story. This is an example of a map which Waddingtons had printed on silk. And these were mainly made for the use of airmen who were likely to be bomber crew, who were likely to be shot down over Germany. And the idea is that printing on silk is not easy, but Waddingtons have been able to do that in Leeds. And so they printed big maps like this, very thin, very light. And the girls in the factory used to take them out as headscarves. And this is one of this. That looks to be Hungarian, so on. But this is so that if they were shot down, they would be able to figure out where they were by some signposts. And these were the same things that were sent to the prisoner of war camp. I don't think if you're in a prisoner of war camp, you're going to try to find out where you are, because these things don't have a UI here printed on them. But at least you would know where some main roads were and things like that. It's fascinating.
There's certainly that story has been coming out sort of gradually since the 1960s. There's an article in one of the Waddingtons magazines that sort of talks about the fact that they had a secret visit in the 1940s. And so they were chosen as the company that could produce high-quality maps that could be sewn into uniforms, not rustle, be folded up small. So, yes, that was, I think, one of the reasons they were chosen. And obviously, Monopoly was also a game sent through the Red Cross for prisoners of war, and the Germans thought that prisoners of war would be sort of nice and docile if they had some board games to stop them getting bored. And obviously this is subverted by the fact that these escape kits were sent out. But I believe that because it was so secret, none of them have ever survived. So nobody has actually come up with any examples of, I think they were sworn to secrecy and that they had to be destroyed.
Today, it's difficult to find any sign of the printing company whose name sits in hundreds of millions of homes around the world. Despite booming business through the middle of the 20th century, problems began to set in, not least of which the arrival of video games. Waddingtons were in some ways a sign of what was to come in the battle between digital and physical media. So the name might be gone, but the legacy of Waddingtons is etched into the history of this city.
After Monopoly, they brought out a game about horse racing called Totopoly. And then there was a game called Buccaneer, where you had to go around collecting bits of treasure as pirates and things like that. And they were all very successful. Then they had Sorry, which was a young children's game. They got Cluedo, then in 1949, and licensed that to Parker Brothers. And actually, Cluedo sales in America in the 50s, the Americans called it Clue, were about 3 times greater than Cluedo sales in the UK. So Cluedo sales in America were balanced by Monopoly sales in the UK. Now that was crucial because Monopoly was never Waddington's property. It was always done under license from Parker Brothers. But just as Waddingtons couldn't afford to lose the Monopoly license, Parker Brothers couldn't afford to lose the Cluedo license either. And then there was a French game called Risk, which was licensed. It was a sort of tripartite alliance between these 3 great games companies. And that lasted successfully and well, with Waddingtons doing Risk and the French company doing Monopoly and Cluedo. That lasted until the early 1970s, actually. But then we got into all sorts of other games, because then it was possible with TV advertising and so on to produce a game, to expect it to sell 250,000 in the second year on the back of heavy TV advertising, and then it would tail off. We missed Scrabble. Scrabble was sent to us, I think, in 1948, and somebody said it'll never sell. So it was taken over by Spears, and I think outsells Monopoly now. I don't know. And we missed Trivial Pursuits in the 1980s that was sent to us. And one individual in our games development department, who I know but won't reveal, said, because I think the board of Waddington quite liked Trivial Pursuits because it was a big departure. No, I know the British public and they will never go for this. It's a bit like the Beatles being turned down by Decca or something. Not quite on the same level. So Waddingtons had begun to miss out, but produced an annual big hit throughout the late 60s and 70s. But by then, they'd got into all sorts of other things, particularly printed folding cartons and plastic containers then. And then it's what we'll call computer station now. It's called continuous stationery at the time. And that was very big. Greeting cards. Valentine's of Dundee was owned by Waddingtons. We had subsidiaries in Canada, Singapore, Australia. So it was a big company, but the base was Leeds. And I think more than half of the people employed by the company were in Leeds. The first real warning sign was when we figured out, and I was with the company at the time, in the late 1970s, that family board games were probably going to be overtaken by video games. Now, that perception was right. But we'd missed the boat on getting into video games at the start, but they were still at a very early stage. So we bought a company called Video Master. And that was a huge mistake. In the words of Victor, we bought the wrong horse, entered it in the wrong races with the wrong jockey and put too much money on it. But the basic idea of going to the races was probably not all bad. However, it cost us a huge, millions in losses. And that forced the company to sell Valentine's of Dundee. But there were other problems as well. We'd become overmanned. We'd become uncompetitive. We were resting on our laurels. We weren't spotting the right opportunities. And throughout the 1970s, and the city expectations of us were very high. So there were 2 hostile bids for Waddingtons by Robert Maxwell. And in order to fend him off, which we did, we had to make such promises of better performance for the city that it was almost impossible to live up to them. We did live up to them, but not at the cost of reinvestment. So by the late 1970s, 1980s, Waddingtons were going okay, but kept selling companies and buying them and so on. And then, well after Victor and I had left the company, well, I really left when I became a Member of Parliament in 1979. The board of Waddingtons in the mid-90s, then decided that the publicly quoted shares of Waddingtons did not justify the true potential that Waddingtons actually had, and they therefore tried to take it private. This was the existing management. The non-executive directors then said, well, if you're going to do that, you've got to open it up to all bidders. We can't just recommend to the shareholders that they should sell their shares to you because you happen to be managing it now. So there was then an open auction for the company, and the management was outbid. So the existing management, the company was taken over by a different consortium. The existing management lost their jobs, and the new buyers, who then changed the name to Communicis, which is a terrible name, I think, then over a long period of years made a mess of it. And it was ultimately taken over by an American company, I think about 7 or 8 years ago. And then tragically, the company still called Communicis went into receivership earlier this year. And that was it. Everyone thinks of Leeds as being a textile city. It wasn't, it was a tailoring city. And that's one of the reasons for Leeds' success, because Bradford was where the textiles were made. So when textiles really started suffering from cheaper imports, the Bradford mills were all on their 3rd and 4th generation and had lost what management competence the early generations had had. I'm being really crude here. So they didn't know how to react. But the tailoring industry in Leeds was still relatively young and nimble. And I think there was a view of, well, that was tailoring. Now what else can we do? And they went on into electronic assembly. And I mean, now, it is the centre of the gaming industry. I don't mean the casino industry. I mean electronic gaming. For reasons that the technological people in Leeds are fast on their feet and nimble and so on. I don't think any of that started with Waddingtons, but it's the nature of the city that it was. I think Waddingtons was probably the sort of company that was likely to arise in Leeds in the 1920s. And the same thing that gives Leeds that quality is what is still today making it a base for so many successful new companies.